In the polished briefing rooms where government press officers craft announcements designed to generate positive headlines whilst obscuring inconvenient realities, the Home Office has issued a statement that should be examined not for what it claims, but for what it reveals about how far Labour will go to declare victory whilst presiding over catastrophic failure. The Home Office announced the successful returns of 19 illegal migrants from Britain to France over the past week, bringing the total under Keir Starmer's historic agreement with Emmanuel Macron to 26. And in the very same announcement, they declared triumph over the previous government's Rwanda scheme, proclaiming that whilst the Conservatives spent years and hundreds of millions without removing a single person, Labour has returned 26 in a matter of weeks. What they desperately hope you will not notice is that since this historic agreement was announced, over 10,000 people have crossed the channel illegally, making the returns ratio approximately 0.26%. Welcome to UK Decoded, where we expose the truth about how government ministers celebrate returning 26 people whilst ignoring that 10,000 have arrived, and how they declare clear messages being sent when migrants in France are openly saying they do not care and will cross anyway. Subscribe now for daily analysis that refuses to accept mathematical illiteracy as legitimate defense of border policy that has completely failed. The Home Office statement that the contrast could not be clearer between Labour's returns and the Conservative Rwanda scheme is technically correct but substantively misleading. The Rwanda scheme was prevented from removing anyone by legal challenges in British and European courts that blocked deportations before they could occur. It failed because of judicial intervention, not because of operational incompetence. The France returns deal faces no such legal obstacles. France is a safe country where returns are legally permissible, yet it has returned only 26 people out of over 10,000 arrivals. This is not success. This is spectacular failure dressed up in the language of achievement by highlighting comparison most favorable to government whilst ignoring the comparison that actually matters. The relevant comparison is not how many the Rwanda scheme removed versus how many the France deal has removed. The relevant comparison is how many people are crossing versus how many are being returned, because that ratio determines whether the policy functions as a deterrent. 0.26%. That is a returns ratio. For every person returned to France, 385 people have successfully crossed and remained in Britain. If you were a migrant in France calculating whether to attempt a crossing, if you understood that your chances of being returned are approximately 1 in 400, would you be deterred? Or would you correctly conclude that Britain's returns deal is theatre rather than substance, announcement rather than enforcement? The Home Office claims they are sending a clear message. If you come here illegally, you face being detained and removed, so think twice before making that journey. But migrants in France are not thinking twice. They are crossing in record numbers because the clear message they are actually receiving is that Britain returns virtually nobody, that the historic agreement produces negligible deportations, and that once you reach British shores your chances of remaining are overwhelming. Shadow Home Secretary Chris Philps' assessment that since the deal was announced over 10,000 have crossed captures the fundamental failure. A deterrent that does not deter is not a deterrent. It is expensive virtue signaling that allows ministers to claim they are taking action whilst the actual problem worsens. The 19 returns this week, the largest single number in one go to date, sounds impressive until you realize that hundreds crossed the channel during that same week. The government is celebrating removing 19 whilst hundreds arrived. The Home Office claimed that enforcement activity against gangs by the National Crime Agency is up 40% on last year is another example of highlighting metrics that sound positive whilst ignoring whether they produce results that matter. Enforcement activity is up. Excellent. How many gang organizers have been arrested? How many smuggling networks have been disrupted? How many boats have been prevented from launching? These are the questions that determine whether increased enforcement activity translates into reduced crossings. And with over 10,000 crossings since the deal was announced, the answer appears to be that enforcement activity increases have not prevented record arrivals. The detail that the government continues to work with France to operate a tightly controlled legal route for an equal number of eligible migrants who will be sent to the UK in return for the deportations reveals the fundamental absurdity of the one-in, one-out arrangement. 9 migrants have arrived in Britain this week through this new legal route. So 19 were returned whilst 9 arrived legally as part of the exchange. The net reduction from this week's historic largest single returns flight was 10 people. 10. Whilst 100 crossed illegally during the same period. This is not border control. This is an elaborate bureaucratic process that creates the appearance of action whilst achieving negligible impact on the actual number of people entering Britain. The government can point to 26 returns and claim success. They can highlight the new legal route and claim they are managing migration humanely. But the bottom line is that over 10,000 people have entered illegally since the deal was announced. 26 have been returned, and 9 have arrived through the legal exchange route, producing net illegal immigration of over 10,000 minus 17, or approximately 9,983 people. Chris Philp's proposal that government should bend the Human Rights Act for immigration matters and deport every single illegal immigrant immediately upon arrival back to their home country or to somewhere like Rwanda represents what effective deterrence would actually require. If people who cross illegally were detained immediately, processed rapidly, and removed within days to either their origin country or a safe third country, the crossing calculus would change dramatically. The current ratio of 1 in 400 being returned would become 1 in 1. Everyone who crosses gets removed. That would constitute genuine deterrence. But Labour cannot implement this approach because it would require legislation to override human rights protections. It would require detention capacity that does not currently exist. It would require safe third country agreements that Britain does not have following the abandonment of Rwanda, and it would require political willingness to accept the inevitable criticism from refugee advocacy groups and European partners. So instead, they announce returns of 26 people out of 10,000 and claim they are sending clear messages whilst migrants openly say they will cross anyway. The migrants in France openly saying they do not care and will cross anyway provides a most honest assessment of Labour's deterrence policy. These are people who understand the actual risk better than Home Office press officers. They know that 26 returns out of 10,000 arrivals means that chances of being removed are negligible. They know that Britain's detention capacity is limited. They know that legal challenges can delay removal for months or years. They know that many migrants who initially face removal orders eventually receive permission to remain through asylum claims or human rights appeals. So they cross, confident that the returns deal is largely symbolic. The accusation that government is weak and dishonest and has lost control of borders is harsh but difficult to refute when examining the evidence. Weak because they announce historic agreements that return virtually nobody. Dishonest because they claim to be sending clear messages whilst migrants ignore those messages and cross in record numbers. Lost control because over 10,000 illegal arrivals since the deal was announced demonstrates that Britain cannot prevent people from entering illegally regardless of what agreements are signed with France. The broader pattern is that Labour promised to be tough on immigration, to stop the boats, to restore border control. In opposition, they attacked the Rwanda scheme as expensive failure. In government, they announced a historic agreement with France that would finally provide genuine returns and deterrence. And the result is over 10,000 arrivals, 26 returns, and migrants in France openly saying they will cross anyway because they understand the returns deal is toothless. This is not the first time Labour has announced breakthrough agreements on immigration that failed to deliver. The party has a history of promising tough enforcement whilst presiding over record immigration increases. What makes the current situation particularly absurd is that they are celebrating the returns of 26 people as vindication of their approach whilst over 10,000 have crossed since the deal was announced. The mathematical illiteracy required to present this as success is staggering. The Home Office could respond to these criticisms by arguing that the deal is in its early stages, that returns will ramp up over time, that the legal route exchanges are just beginning, and that deterrence effects take time to materialize. These would be reasonable arguments if there was evidence supporting them. But 10,000 crossings since the deal was announced suggest that deterrence is not materializing. And the structural constraints, limited detention capacity, legal challenges, French reluctance to accept large numbers of returns, suggest that even if returns increase from 26 to perhaps 100 or 200, there would remain a tiny fraction of arrivals. The only way the returns deal could become effective deterrent is if returns increase by approximately 50 times, from 26 out of 10,000 to around 5,000 out of 10,000. Does anyone believe that France will accept 5,000 deportations? Does anyone believe Britain has a detention capacity, legal framework, and operational capability to identify, process, and remove 5,000 people? The policy that government is celebrating as a historic achievement would need to increase effectiveness by 50 times to provide meaningful deterrence, an improvement so dramatic that it is effectively impossible. This is why Chris Philp's assessment that the deal will see only a pathetic number sent back, and has failed to act as a deterrent is almost certainly correct. The structural constraints prevent it from scaling to levels that would provide genuine deterrence. And migrants understand this, which is why they openly say they will cross anyway. Labour can announce historic agreements and celebrate largest single returns flights of 19 people, but until the returns ratio approaches double digits as a percentage rather than remaining at 0.26%. The policy is sophisticated-sounding failure that changes nothing about Britain's inability to control its borders whilst costing millions that could be spent on detention facilities and deportation operations that might actually work.